Welcome back, everybody, and happy Monday or Tuesday or whenever. I want to review here real quick just some things we kind of wrapped up with the last lecture last week. Um, Actually, it's not mine, whatever day it is. See, lose track. Anyway, want to pick up where we left off with a little bit of review here. All right. We talked about some different ways in which this natural selection can direct a population to change. Remember, evolution is a change in allele frequency in a population over time. And if the alleles change, well, that has an effect on what these things actually look like. So we can have directional selection if, in the case of birds with their beaks, if because of the food sources that are available, all the birds with smaller beaks starve and the birds with larger beaks live, well, over time, the average beak size is going to get to be larger. We call that directional selection. We can also have stabilizing selection, where the average size or the average color or height or whatever is what's selected for, what has the advantage, and the extremes have the disadvantage. The example I gave of that was human birth weight, where it's a really significant disadvantage to have for a baby to be extremely small, like 2 pound baby. It's also an extreme disadvantage, and the baby is likely, things aren't going to go too well for baby or mom if the baby weighs 18 pounds. So the kind of medium average size baby between about 5 or 6 pounds on the small end and 9 or 10 pounds on the large end, those are the size that have the advantage. Okay, so stabilizing selection that, there aren't many that survive with the largest, there aren't many that survive with the smallest, so the size tends to stay pretty consistent. And then we have disruptive selection, which is the opposite of that, where the medium or average is selected against, its numbers go down, and the extremes are what survive. So if we go back to birds, maybe there's two possible food sources. There's insects and there's large seeds. And the birds with small beaks are really good at catching and eating insects, and the birds with the large beaks are good at cracking open the large seeds. But the birds with the medium-sized beaks, they can't crack open the large seeds and they can't catch the insects, so they all starve. So what we end up with in a case like that is disruptive selection, where the two extremes diverge and end up potentially becoming two separate populations or even separate species. Okay? Now, another thing that can occur in a population, especially if the population is small, is we can have a change in allele frequency in a population over time that actually is not caused by natural selection. It's not caused by one allele having an advantage, being better adapted for the environment, and another allele being, poorly adapted. If there's a very small population, random chance plays a role here, okay? Some just might happen to have more babies than others, and others might just happen to have fewer babies. That would be called genetic drift, where the allele frequency just kind of drifts. It just changes randomly. Now, this only really happens in a small population, especially a very small population. One example of genetic drift is the founder effect, okay? And this happens with islands a lot, all right? Let's take a hypothetical scenario here. Let's say that there's a ship that sinks in a storm, and only 10 people make it onto the lifeboat. Everyone else drowns. 10 people make it on the lifeboat, 5 men, 5 women. And let's say that just by random chance, the 10 people who make it onto the lifeboat, of those 10 people, maybe 6 of them have red hair. Okay. Now, worldwide, the whole human population worldwide is only about 1 or 2% have red hair. But if 6 out of 10 people on that lifeboat, just because of random chance, how the ship went down and which people happened to be close to the lifeboat at that time, if 6 of the 10 have red hair, and then that lifeboat with 10 people on it makes it to an island, those 10 people survive and they start a new community there. Well, now 60% of the people on that island are going to have red hair or something close to it. Okay? This can happen when animals or plants make their way just randomly to a new island, right? If they kind of float out to sea and happen to land on an island, well, if there's only a very small number of them, the founders, then that affects what alleles are on that island to begin with. Okay? So this picture just shows an example of genetic drift, where over here we have a large population of these beetles with a wide range of phenotypes, all different colors and patterns and everything, right? But if we just randomly grab a group of 4 here and a group of 4 here and put these 4 onto one island and these 4 onto another, well, even though in this large population, maybe this was on the mainland, we have a wide range of colors and patterns, over here on this island, where the population was started by only this small number, we have one set of colors and patterns. And over here, where we had a different group of founders, we have a very different set of colors and patterns that are on that island. Okay? That's genetic drift. Now, real quickly here, I'm going to go through this. If you take AP Bio, you'll talk more about Hardy-Weinberg. This is it's essentially a mathematical equation that we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on, but you should be familiar with the basic idea here. There are 5 conditions of Hardy-Weinberg. Let me explain what they are, and then that may get us a little bit in a better position to understand what Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is. Okay? The 5 conditions are random mating, large population, no immigration or immigration, so nothing moving in or out, no mutation, and no natural selection. What the Hardy-Weinberg equation or Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium says is, if these 5 conditions are met of a given population, if in that population there's random mating, the population is large, nobody's moving in or out, there's no mutation taking place, and there's no natural selection. If those 5 conditions are met, then evolution will not occur. That's what Hardy-Weinberg says. Now, the reality is, in real life, these 5 conditions are never actually met because there's always mutations going on. There's always natural selection happening. You don't always have a large population. Random mating is not always occurring. And there's often movement into or out of the population. These 5 conditions are never met. But it's useful for scientists studying evolution to be able to say, okay, if these 5 conditions were met, then there wouldn't be evolution happening. Now, we observe that evolution is happening in this particular population. So let's try to figure out which of these conditions are not being met. Okay, let's look. Is there non-random mating going on? Are say the females of the species being really choosy of the males? Okay, well, if we see that evolution is occurring, then we should check, is there actually random mating happening? Or we can look at, well, what kind of mutations are happening? So these are more not things that we would ever expect to actually see in nature, all 5 of these conditions being met, but these are kind of things to be checked for evolutionary biologists. Okay? Just know these 5 conditions. They might occur on a future test, which is likely to be next week. Just saying. Okay. Now, covering a lot of kind of just little things here. Well, short things, but they're really important. One that we need to know, we keep using this term, species. Okay? What is a species? It turns out that species is actually a really tricky word to define. It's one of those things, we all know what a species is, right? Like horses and lions and dogs, right? And sugar maple trees, and we know what species are, but how do we actually define it? The definition we're going to use here is a group of individuals that breed with one another and produce fertile offspring. Basically, they are able to interbreed with each other, and that in nature they actually do interbreed with each other. And not only do they interbreed with each other, but that their offspring are fertile. Their offspring themselves are able to have babies. Okay? It's important that we put that other part there because we do have examples of different species that sometimes interbreed with each other and have offspring, but those offspring are not fertile. Maybe the best known example of this are mules. You may know that a mule is the hybrid of a donkey and a horse. Okay? You cross, I believe it's a male donkey and a female horse, and you get a mule. Now, mules are very useful animals for carrying heavy loads and for moving over rough terrain, but a mule cannot have offspring. Mules are sterile. The only way to get another mule is to cross another horse and another donkey together. So, the fact that horses and donkeys cannot have fertile offspring tells us that horses and donkeys are different species. Okay? Now, speciation is the process of one species becoming another species, or one species diverging into two species or more species. I want to go pretty quickly through these three patterns of speciation. Okay? Behavioral, geographic, and temporal. Behavioral speciation is what occurs when two different populations are separated from each other for a time, for hundreds, thousands, even millions of years. And over that time, they start to develop different behaviors. If those behaviors start to become so different that then when we put those two species back together, they don't recognize each other anymore, well, then they're not going to interbreed. A good example of this are bird songs. You probably know that different species of birds have different song patterns. Okay, some birds, like these down here, they do like a mating dance. They get in a particular pose, a posture. Okay, and every species has a little bit different song and a little bit different posture, a little bit different mating pattern. Well, if we take birds, populations of the same species, and put them, say, on different islands for thousands of years, and then we bring them back together, maybe during that time on the different islands, the different populations have started singing different songs. And now, if you put these two populations that are singing different songs together, the females of one population are not going to listen and care about the songs of the males from the other population because it's not the right song in their minds. And in that case, their behaviors have made them different species. Even if maybe biologically they're able to interbreed, they're just not going to choose to interbreed anymore because they don't recognize each other as different species, as the same species any longer. Okay? That's behavioral speciation. Another is geographic. If two populations are just separated geographically, so they can't physically encounter each other anymore, they may eventually diverge and become different species. They could be on different islands. Or here's an example of squirrels that are divided by the Grand Canyon. These two species of squirrels are very similar. You can see they have similar ears, their tails are similar, they have similar behaviors, but they're a little bit different from each other. What happened was millions of years ago, the Colorado River here, going through Arizona, started carving its way down into this rock. And eventually it got to the point where the Grand Canyon was formed. And squirrels, of course, cannot get across the Grand Canyon. It's a mile deep and several miles wide. They're not able to get across it anymore. So the squirrels on one side of the Grand Canyon, on the south side of the Grand Canyon, and the squirrels on the north side of the Grand Canyon can't encounter each other anymore. They can't interbreed with each other in nature anymore. And so they're basically different species. They've been separated for millions of years. If we take a kaibab squirrel and put it with the Albert squirrels, they're not going to recognize each other as the same species anymore. They will not choose to interbreed. Okay? Even if in a lab they're biologically able to reproduce, the fact that they don't do it in nature means they are different species or on the way to becoming different species. And finally, we have temporal speciation. Temporal refers to time. This is more about plants, especially plants that flower. The flowers, you probably know, produce pollen, and the pollen from one flower has to get to another flower of the same species in order to produce seeds. Well, some types of plants only flower for a very short time. The flowers may only last a few days. And if we have one population that flowers, say, in May, and another population that flowers in July, then they're not going to be able to pollinate each other anymore, and they will become separate species. So that is temporal speciation. Okay? So we've covered some patterns of speciation here. Should be pretty good on that. Review anything that you didn't catch. Have a good one.